Hi, I'm Jess.
I'm Ryan. You're listening to Your Therapist is Not Okay.
Today we're going to be talking about a theme that we actually brought up last podcast episode, which was talking about men in therapy and the veneer potentially that men don't seek therapy as much as women. So before we dive into this topic that Ryan and I are actually quite excited about, we realized as we started preparing for this podcast that actually we're going to be talking about some darker themes today. We want to give that as a huge trigger warning to anybody. We will be talking about sexual violence, sexual assault, sexual motifs that can actually inhibit the therapy work. If this is something you're struggling with and something you don't want to dive into today, you want maybe a lighter day, please skip this episode. It'll be scattered throughout, so we can't even keep you safe by saying skip to a certain time. And if you want to talk to somebody, reach out to us. We can hook you up with a good therapist if that's something you need. For anyone else that wants to kind of tune into this awesome episode, please continue on.
And we kind of thought we might start with first discussing what have been our experiences around do men come to therapy? Do there seem to be fewer men in therapy? We did notice, and we've talked about before together, Jess and I, that men face a lot of barriers to coming to therapy or even getting any help, really, even medical help. A lot of this is around the way that men are socialized, growing up to
Mm,
be kind of
yeah.
independent and tough, not to cry, and even just kind of asking for help can be considered a sign of weakness. So, because of kind of that idea, which is steeped in male privilege as well, it's just not comfortable for men always to go into spaces where they might be confronted with their own emotions or their own softness.
I think what you're referring to also usually has the term attached to it of toxic masculinity.
Yep.
That you don't get to do feminine, quote unquote, things. And I think that this is so negative, not only who those who might interact with other men, but also for men who kind of cling to this motif. This motif allows you to really negate any form of remote emotional response. It negates you actually being able to really seek out something that might be deemed for women. Now, therapy was not often just with women like therapists. Therapy actually started with male clinicians and they had it within the realm of science. Even when Freud started, they tried to couch it within the realm of being a doctor.
Mhm.
But as this has moved on, it's actually not uncommon for more and more psychotherapists in the field to be women identifying. And therefore, it can seem like a quote unquote feminine avenue to go down to seek help. And
Mm.
I think that that is really, really tricky because it almost creates this aspect of this might not be for you, or you're this kind of man if you seek this out.
I hadn't thought of this before you said that, Jess, but I was kind of thinking that like part of that is also some of the journey of therapy as and probably initially being regarded as a very intellectual and rational kind of route to healing. That was really very much the era of science that talk therapy emerged out of. And with it now being more about feelings and processing emotions, which was always a fundamental part of it, but it was actually later theorists, many of whom were not men, um, that changed that narrative around. But I guess that kind of opens the door for it being a little less, quote, man friendly.
If you think about it this way, in the
Yeah.
very beginning, in the 1890s and early 1900s, a lot of times this was about women's subjugation. The term hysteria was coined during this kind of time of hysterical women that might have been women who've been sexually abused by their families, by and their brothers. They would be labeled hysterical, and they often would be institutionalized because they were rebelling against what had been done to their bodies. We fast forward now to today. We've moved away from this motif of hysteria, but now this is now a woman's subject. And again, can be quite demeaned in that kind of way of to seek this out might not be necessarily the most masculine. It's more of a
Mm.
like a soft science, so to speak.
It's a really good point. Absolutely. And it does kind of link into another kind of thing that we've both noticed in our practices is that it can be difficult for men to be able to admit that they've been harmed, especially if it was a sexual assault or, another situation in which they felt kind of sexually violated. Um, and there is a lot of motifs about and social expectations that men always want sex and should
Yeah.
always be, happy and victorious or something when they get sex. So it's not really a an option to not want it. And it might be people might not even be aware. Some men might not even be aware that actually I didn't want that. And
Yes.
I can't tell someone like,
That
oh,
wasn't
I,
fun
I
for
was
me.
assaulted by a woman that part of our belief system is that that's demeaning.
A lot of clients that have been seen by therapists often have to come to this realization that this wasn't consensual. I didn't like this. And it can be quite complicated for a male client because often there's arousal involved. Our bodies respond even when our heads are saying this is scary. And to be able to start to work within that complication even around the social construct that you have to want it, or that you should be proud of this. You got
Mhm.
something. It can be quite difficult to know how to wrap our minds around how am I a victim in this?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. When every story I've heard tells me that I am the conqueror.
Yeah.
And we were reflecting about the way sometimes men start in therapy.
Mm.
Um, Whereas sometimes there'd be this vibe where men can come in very, I use the term gung ho,
Hmm.
um, and they really come in they're like, I want to do a ton of therapy, like I'm going to work on this and resolve this, and that's one really exciting. That's like cool to see that enthusiasm, but just kind of observe that like they might say that and then kind of disappear.
There is something in the interim period between that first session, which I think is actually incredibly true. I like that
Mhm.
there is an excitement there.
Yeah.
There's something in the interim that happens that might be quite fearful. To go to see a therapist is never something that's not a courageous act because you're going to be diving into things that are always difficult. But probably in the interim, what I think happens, I wonder if you agree, Ryan, is that like there's this moment where you realize everything that could be opened up.
Yeah.
And if we link that back to what we were just talking about, we might actually have to challenge some things, some defenses that have kept us safe. That I did want this particular sexual content or a contact, or I did really want to be able to um, feel like the kind of prowess man, or I did
Mhm.
have a good childhood. I am tough as a male. There could be a lot of different kind of socializations that might have to be challenged if you're going to be able to work with me. And I could see that being actually quite tricky. What started
Mhm.
out as like, I really want to do this work to be, do I? Do I really want to do all this work?
Right. I mean, at the heart of the toxic masculinity that we just talked about is like one of the primary things connecting all the facets of toxic masculinity is avoidance of vulnerability.
Mm,
And in therapy, you are profoundly vulnerable,
yes.
even if you're not saying anything, even if you're just sitting there in the room or on the screen with a therapist. There's a big vulnerability, and that can be scary. I guess we talk sometimes about what Freud called optimal frustration.
Yeah.
And it can be sometimes with men kind of coming in being really excited and gung ho, it might be more than the optimal frustration. It might be too scary for them to feel like, okay, I'm gonna come back.
Going to therapy has the potential to change your life. You can
Hmm.
start to see things that you didn't see before, start to navigate your own defenses that have kept you safe.
Yeah.
But I could see, based on what we're talking about, that that actually could feel quite tricky to be able to dive into this world that might feel safer to keep a lid on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm kind of curious, Jess, what your experiences have been like working with cis men being a woman therapist.
Yeah, Denise had asked about complications in it or if it can ever be scary. I thought that was a really good question. Um, I think that there's a lot of theory out there. So I'm gonna be a bit of a geek and talk about some of it, but I've seen it in my own office. So it's like theory that is actually I've seen alive.
Yeah.
And I find I have a lot of male clients, and I'm not going to speak for all of them when I talk about this, but there can be a fear in talking about, let's say, sex because it might feel like there's that motif of being maybe a predator or making me feel scary. I can notice sometimes clients might want to keep me safe. And there's a really interesting piece of work, of research, kind of a while ago, but in 2011, where it talks about this aspect that we may actually use transference in a very different way between a heteronormative relationship between a cis female therapist and a cis man. And what they talk about in that is that we might actually avoid topics, both as therapist and as client, to keep the relationship kind of more maternal and more safe. Men may not talk about, for example, erotic transference, that they might be feeling something about me as a therapist, because to do so might again make them a predator. And I might not talk about what I might be feeling in the room because I might actually fear being that motif of the seductress, the siren. And so what happens is a huge piece of really awesome work can actually get kind of buried in order for us to keep me as mother, to keep me as maybe more maternal, more safe. Um, and that actually can be quite difficult because as we're avoiding this obvious term of like sexual assault within the therapy room is what they talk about in their research, both of us actually deny talking about a really important topic. And that can be really tricky. Um, but this aspect of seeing me might also feel safer to complicate this because based on this socialization we are talking about, I have a lot of men that actually chose to see me because it might be safer to be more vulnerable with me as a
Yeah.
woman than it is than they might with a man. Again, based on like how men might be perceived by other men. And so for me, it's that complication of like, how much do we get to talk about? Because you might want to keep me safe, and I might want to keep me safe.
Hmm.
And how much do we get to share because I am that safety? So it's a weird tension that I found this research is talking about, and I've definitely seen it in my office. Not I would not say all the time, but I would say definitely it's something that's really real in the therapy room. And in my PhD, this theme came up again and again as I was talking to women identifying therapists about how they feel in the therapy room, um, identifying as a woman. So it's something that's really alive in the therapy room for sure.
Absolutely. And I had written when we were making notes before this that men fear other men, and I was just thinking as we were going through this that actually men fear men. It's not even other men. I think there's a fear of the man within us as well, right? Like that we're going to be somehow feminized or that we're going to punish ourselves. But there's also that the fear that you named before of being a predator.
Yeah.
I've worked with many clients and just know many men who in day-to-day life are very afraid that, like, unbeknownst to even themselves, they're a
Yes.
predator. And a lot of these men that I know that have those fears are, to my knowledge, not
Yeah.
predatory at all. They're good men.
And the motifs that come outside of the therapy room, I'm thinking about clients that talk about like the fear of being behind a woman when walking or like that
Yeah.
aspect of being in the night and like passing a woman and being like I'm really safe, I'm super duper safe, like how do I say that without sounding incredibly not safe?
Let me tell you what, Jess, when you've got a beard, you just cross the road. Nothing that I say in the dark is going to be comforting to a stranger, especially if they're afraid.
And in my work with my women identifying clients, there is a real fear there. So I don't want to negate that at all, but I am
Yes.
speaking from the man perspective that that is something that you do have to contend with. And
Hmm.
it doesn't go away in the therapy room.
Absolutely right. And I do think that whether a cis man decides to see another man as a therapist or a woman or someone with a different gender identity, there are always different opportunities for kind of like healing transferences, right? It might be a first opportunity to have like a safe and honest relationship with a woman.
Mm,
It might be a first opportunity to talk to a man and have them validate your emotions and not judge you and not say like, oh, like, dude, that's weird.
yeah.
Um, or whatever the dudes at the baseball diamond, I don't know, sports might say.
You did start
All
our
my cis
call.
man.
You did start our call saying, "Hey, you can call me coach," because you're wearing a baseball cap.
Because in I don't know, maybe a moment of transference, like I've worn a baseball cap. I'm looking like coach, like we joked about in season one.
Yeah.
It's just because I had a late night. Yeah, so there's that fear of having leaky sexual energy is what someone I've worked with has referred to it as. And there's kind of that opportunity for another person to give you feedback that you wouldn't normally get, right? So if you're being inappropriately sexual, you're not doing anything assaultive per se, but you're being maybe like kind of creepy or
Mm.
like a little too intense and direct about some kind of desire that you're having. Most of the time in day-to-day life, say you're at your bar, say you're at the park or something like that, that person you're making uncomfortable is just going to leave to make themselves
Mm.
safe, and fair enough. But you maybe have that opportunity in therapy to process that, for someone to actually give you that feedback of like, oh, something took a turn here, and you're speaking to me in a different way than you were
Mhm.
before. Or, I kind of notice you're maybe posturing a little bit, or just to kind of ask into that and maybe for the first time have someone have some self-awareness that like, oh, I'm making people uncomfortable. Maybe this is why people don't stick around and talk to me. Maybe this is why I struggle attracting the quote opposite sex.
Absolutely. And if you're able to process that, even though it can feel quite implicating and shaming,
Hmm.
you're on an avenue for change, which is incredible to start to recognize how the very maybe unconscious ways you're presenting yourself can actually drive people away.
I guess as we're saying that, I'm thinking there's so much of that that can also be about how are you trying to get your needs met through a way that you were socialized was acceptable.
Yeah.
Anyone that's socialized as a man is kind of taught directly and indirectly that having prowess,
Mm.
having, masculine sexual energy is like these things are acceptable ways to get your needs met,
Yeah.
to feel in control, to feel powerful, which are things that we all need, regardless of gender at different times, but we're taught different ways to secure them.
Yeah.
But it may allow us, through talking about it and process things, to actually access what is the need that
Mm.
I'm trying to have met. And
Yes.
is there a different way that I can approach having it met that doesn't scare people off, or maybe is actually more aligned with the values that I wish to hold, rather than just kind of this ingrained social teaching? And I've experienced a lot of this myself as well, being non-binary. But I was socialized as a man. I was raised as a man. So I've grappled with a lot of these ideas of toxic masculinity myself, and letting go of a lot of it. To even just say that I'm non-binary is like, very snowflakey of me. Um, and I've embraced that. There's nothing wrong with me being unique and special. But even as I say those things, like that idea of being unique and special and having needs, needing, to be treated with dignity,
Yeah.
even those things are things that men are not socialized to seek or ask for.
Yeah.
And I would consider those to be things that all humans need. So it's interesting that we've chosen to kind of repress that in half-ish of the population.
I'm thinking about this aspect of what our actions do, what we've been told we're allowed to have. but that even some of the most quote unquote cringy or uncomfortable things that you're talking about usually have an underlying need of wanting to belong, of wanting to be chosen, of wanting to be loved. Like most of our actions, even if they might seem at the surface as something that's problematic, usually the need underneath is not. Like if I'm
Yeah.
being cringy because I'm attracted to somebody, I don't have the right socialization to know how to be somebody that doesn't like that knows how to get this in a way that is appropriate, sure. But the need isn't inappropriate. The need is that like I want to belong here.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of thinking as you're saying that like there's the discomfort or the, kind of creepiness that people might sense can almost be in opposition to the so-called cringe, right? Because cringe is often like saying the thing like, I really just need to know that you guys care about me,
Hmm.
right? That's like too cringy for tolerance for I feel like a lot of men and a lot of Gen Zs or something like that. Like that the cringe fear is extreme. I love cringe.
Me
Um,
too.
it's just, I think it's fabulous. But having kind of myself gone through some evolutions with toxic masculinity, and I think most of the time I'm pretty obviously queer, and on all my, any place that I'm practicing, it's got my pronouns on there and stuff. So I think there can also be an element as a non-binary person where I feel like men think, oh, I can relate to them,
Mhm.
but I don't have to fear not being masculine around them because they've already failed at that. I'm like the master loser at being a man.
Mm.
And I love that I'm like, yeah, okay. That's if throwing me a little under the bus to feel safe helps you to stick it through and take my profoundly harsh criticisms and challenges, um, then great. So I love being on, I'll stay under that bus all day. It's fine.
Well, it feels like a game that you didn't want to win. Like you actually
No.
kind of won by like breaking out of this socialization model.
And that leads me to my geeky moment that I had
Go
not
for it.
even planned, which is this book that I absolutely love by the queer theorist Jay Halberstam. And it's called The Queer Art of Failure. And it's
Hmm.
all about how failure is a way to succeed at being queer. So if you reject the thing that you're failing at, I reject gender norms. I reject
Yep.
the ideas that support toxic masculinity. And
Yep.
so I am thrilled to be a failure because it
Yes.
means I can rewrite what I actually want to succeed at.
You can
And
thrive
that is
within
something that
that.
I love supporting men, whether they're queer or cis or straight or whatever, to do for themselves. Because even if you're a cis man and you have every intention of being a heterosexual cis man, you could still choose to fail at traditional masculinity and create a new masculinity that speaks to you and the people you love.
I like that because it feels like you actually get to thrive within this new way of
Mm.
choosing something different. That we might have failed something incredibly toxic, and now we're succeeding in who am I? What is my identity? How do I want to relate in a way that's not just this schema of what I have to do? And I think that, to be honest, I think a lot of my clients would like that too, and do like that, and do strive for that. I think that within my own social world, a lot of the people that I get to interact with are also striving to rewrite some of the ways that they were brought up.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there can still be pretty deeply seated um, archetypes for how men are supposed to be, right? We've kind of talked broadly about the socialization, about toxic masculinity. I've noticed often when I work with cis men, things around being a protector, being a hunter, being a breadwinner, being a warrior, like literally, like a lot of men do think of themselves with kind of this warrior motif. And I think, I've got a little bit of Jungian flair in me, so I do think this connects with something deep in human history about the different roles that people played, which we know very well from anthropology and archaeology that like it was not as divided by gender as we might sometimes wish to think.
Hmm.
Um, but still, modern men tend to cling to those kind of warrior and hunter, protector, ruler motifs.
I think that often any kind of trope or cliche comes from somewhere
Yeah,
and can also be reinforced by who you're dating and or who you're seeking. Um, this aspect of nice guys finish last is not actually that wrong, right? Like in some ways, like you can actually see it because that trope gets reinforced by narratives, but we can also see this aspect of how men can actually watch in real time someone who they might consider toxic, maybe being more successful at the bar. And I think that you and I have wanted to stay away from this topic, so I'm also going to, but like that can be a really like we've seen that be a problem right now in real time with the way that that can also be incredibly toxic of thinking I'm just a nice guy, I'm not going to get the girl. At the
right,
same time, there are a lot of tropes that, as you rightfully say, can be quite successful. And it's also about challenging those and about navigating what does this actually say about me? What do I want to work on?
right.
And who am I really? If I can start to challenge some of these very cyclical kind of schemas that I'm seeing.
I do think this is like one of the kind of modern challenges that's facing society is we've done a lot of work to kind of break down what men are doing wrong. And
Yeah,
all kinds of different people are perhaps doing wrong. What society is less successful at, and I think you and individual interactions are really good at calling this out, is
yeah,
being only destructive and not constructive. So
yes,
while we may have done a lot of work as a society to say like men shouldn't do these things,
yeah,
we have done less work because probably because it's harder,
yeah,
probably because it's new to say here's a healthier way that you could be a man. So we have said everything you are is bad, and I have no alternative for you, which I think can cause this kind of overcorrection where people go then like, okay, fine, then I'm gonna be either like jaded and wounded about this and feel I haven't gotten what I deserve, what
yes.
society kind of quote owes me, because men are socialized to think that society owes them money and success and women. Um, so there can be that kind of overcorrection. Or we also see then there's a vacuum into which even more toxic stuff can come in around even like fascism and domination.
What you're talking about is totally something that you and I talk about all the time. I hate just deconstructive because it doesn't do anything. What you see now is what you just said. Like if you have a beard, cross the street, right? Like that's a deconstructive model. That means that you're automatically bad for who you are, and all you can do is retreat.
Yep.
And that's also a problematic answer. And so for me, I kind of want to take that idea and move it
Mm.
into a constructive realm. How can we make therapy safer and more like accessible for men? What can we do? What is there something that we can actually push forward even today in this chat to kind of start to play with ideas?
I mean, I think the first thing there is just kind of connecting those points of thinking like, okay, as therapists, we need to be ready to support people to be constructive as well as destructive, right? To not just um, only choose the things about them that are bad, but to really be intentional and conscious. And I have to remind myself about this too, because I have a lot of snap reactions to cis men, as
Yes, you do.
Denise and Jess were noticing when we were preparing for this episode. And at the heart of it, I feel this kind of like deep tenderness and love and fear
Hmm.
of cis men. Cis men were my tormentors. Cis men are my tormentors probably still.
Yeah.
That's when I'm afraid at night. It's because there's a group of men. So anyway, therapists, including myself, we have to be ready to kind of offer insights, alternatives to our cis men clients to kind of say like, hey, like let's think about what that need is and a different way you would be comfortable getting it met. Or can we think of other attributes about you that we value besides your success or your physical prowess? Um, yeah. And I guess I kind of already touched on this, but just generally for a therapist to be really ready for the counter transference that may come up for us in working with men. I've shared a little bit of what that is for me, and I think that clearly will also come up for women and cis male therapists as well, that we're all going to have our experiences and relationships to masculinity. Um, so if we as therapists can kind of start it by not judging men for existing, by being a welcome space to say like, hey, you can be here, you can cry here, you can also say some toxic stuff that you need to express and process through, and I'm
Absolutely.
not gonna quote cancel you immediately.
This can be your place to actually be free. What if therapy was the place where you get to play and explore? And I think that therapy, even though it is for the individual, can actually be an incredible avenue for you to be able to start to challenge yourself with a
Mhm.
therapist that is safe to do so. And the other thing I'm going to say is when we start to deconstruct or have these motifs that men don't come to therapy, actually, men come to therapy a lot.
They
I have
do.
a ton of male clients.
Mhm.
And there's one of the ways that we're already breaking the schema that therapy and men don't go together is that a lot of my clients and a lot of my friends actually love the green flag of a man saying they're going to therapy. So in a lot of dating apps, it's actually not uncommon for a man to say, I go to therapy, I hope you do too, or some sort of variation of that. And a lot of people that I know find that a huge green flag. Now, I'm talking specifically in a heteronormative sense, but even there, it's becoming something incredibly positive and
Yeah.
reinforced. So this
Yeah.
is one area that we can have a veneer that men aren't going to therapy, but here's one of the places where we can already see that this shift is happening. If we
Okay.
can bring this just out of the heteronormative dating world where men can then be with other men in this, we are now on a track to allow this to be a very normalized practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of is that green flag is like an area to, yeah, just reinforce the positivity of going to therapy. And maybe we can have it bleed into other spaces too, where maybe men are encouraging other men to go to therapy.
Yeah.
I know I see this in, queer social apps as well, where folks are saying like, please don't talk to me unless you've been to therapy, or um, even like, I hope you've deconstructed your internalized homophobia, which is kind of like, yeah,
Yeah.
I would say it's a form of toxic masculinity that is, shows up in a lot of queer folks, and maybe a topic for another time too.
Mm, yeah.
Um, but yeah, that it's something that's really important to Jess and I, that we work towards normalizing therapy for everyone.
Absolutely. And the more that we share this information about like what it's done for us, the more we're able to dive in. Therapy isn't a checkbox, I would say. It's
No.
an aspect of being able to recognize some of our patterns of behavior, an avenue to change them, and then celebrate those. We're never going to be fixed. And that's actually a wonderful thing because there's always more that we get to learn about ourselves and work on and play with. And so the more that we're able to talk about this, actually, is something that's incredibly important because it is a green flag. It shows that you're doing some of the work to care for yourself, to recognize how your past has impacted you, how socialization has impacted you. And sometimes I think this value that men don't go to therapy is actually also problematic because it also perpetuates this denial of therapy, whereas actually quite a few do. And being able to recognize that can be actually one of the first constructive points of change, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, a big part of why we created this podcast in the first place, was just noticing how much more we want to normalize it, how much we want to make therapy and what happens behind the door or on the screen to not be some kind of dirty secret.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna say, keep in mind, Even Tony Soprano went to therapy.
On that note, thank you so much for listening. We actually really encourage you. If this actually resonates with you and you're not in therapy and you want to, go ahead, dive in. Find somebody that you trust, that you kind of know that you can work with, and know that this is a space where you get to challenge something and you get to work with it. And therapy's not easy, but it's definitely for everyone. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our others. And stay tuned for even more episodes coming up.
Follow us and leave a review on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please tell your friends.
You can also follow us on Instagram too at Your Therapist Is Not Okay. Also, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, send us a DM there. We would love to answer your questions. And a lot of our topics come from listeners just like you.